Lieutenant Miller, the Navy takeoff instructor, stood on the deck holding two checkered flags. He would signal Doolittle when to apply full power and when to release brakes. The timing had to be perfect. The Hornet's bow was rising and falling 60 feet with each swell. Miller had to time the launch so Doolittle would reach the end of the deck just as the bow was rising, giving the bomber extra lift. Miller watched the swells, counting the rhythm. He raised his flags. Doolittle pushed the throttles to full power. The twin Wright Cyclone engines roared. The B-25 strained against its brakes, the entire aircraft shaking with power. Miller watched the bow drop into a trough, then begin rising. At the exact moment, he slashed both flags down. Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber lurched forward, accelerating down the rain-slicked deck. In the co-pilot seat, Cole watched the deck edge rushing toward them. They were heavy, so heavy. 27,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, and bombs. The deck was pitching. The bomber was accelerating, but would it be enough? Doolittle held the nose down, building speed. 40 Mach, 50 Mach, 60 Mach. The deck edge was coming fast. 70 Mach, not enough. They needed 75 Mach minimum. The deck edge vanished beneath them. For a heart-stopping moment, the B-25 hung in the air, balanced between flying and falling. Then the nose lifted, the bomber's wings bit into the air, and they were climbing. Doolittle had done it. The first fully loaded Army bomber had successfully launched from a carrier deck in combat conditions. Behind him, the Navy crew cheered. But there was no time to celebrate. 15 more bombers had to launch, and the launch window was ticking away. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's aircraft, number 2, rolled into position. 1 minute after Doolittle launched, Hoover was airborne, then number 3, then 4. The launches continued like clockwork, each pilot successfully getting his bomber off the deck despite the pitching and the short distance. Ted Lawson, piloting the 7th aircraft, later described his launch. "We seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. I could see the ocean directly ahead. I thought we were going in. Then I felt the lift, felt the controls respond, and we were flying. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until we were 200 feet above the water." The launches continued without incident until aircraft number 16, the last bomber, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow. Farrow's aircraft had the longest takeoff run, spotted at the very rear of the deck with nearly 800 feet ahead of him. But he also faced the strongest headwind as the Hornet had accelerated to maximum speed. At 9:20 a.m., exactly 1 hour after Doolittle's launch, Farrow's B-25 lifted off the deck. All 16 bombers were airborne, formed up, and heading toward Japan. Behind them, the task force was already turning east, running at maximum speed away from Japanese waters. Admiral Halsey knew that Japanese patrol aircraft would soon be searching for the carriers. The Hornet and Enterprise had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the Japanese response. The Army bombers were on their own now, 650 miles from their targets, flying on the edge of their range toward the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The 16 B-25s cruised west in loose formation at 200 feet above the Pacific, trying to stay below Japanese radar coverage. Doolittle navigated by dead reckoning and compass, cross-checked against the waves below. There were no radio beacons to follow, no landmarks in the featureless ocean. Navigation errors could mean missing Japan entirely or running into heavy defenses. The weather deteriorated as they approached Japan. Rain squalls reduced visibility. The bombers spread out, each crew navigating independently toward their assigned target areas. Doolittle's plan had designated specific targets for each aircraft. Doolittle himself would strike Tokyo, hitting military and industrial targets in the capital. Other crews were assigned targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. The goal was to spread the attacks across multiple cities, creating the impression of a larger raid and forcing the Japanese to defend a wide area. As the Japanese coastline appeared through the haze, the crews received their first shock. There was no opposition. No fighters scrambled to intercept. No anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese, despite the warning from the Nidomaru, had calculated that American carriers couldn't possibly launch bombers at that distance. They expected a carrier strike by naval aircraft, which had much shorter range. The early morning alert had been downgraded. Fighters had been recalled. The Japanese homeland defense was standing down just as 16 American bombers approached the coast. Doolittle crossed the coastline at 12:15 p.m., just past noon Tokyo time. It was a Saturday, and the city was busy with normal weekend activity. Doolittle's navigator, Lieutenant Potter, recognized landmarks from their planning. "That's Tokyo Bay. Target area dead ahead." Doolittle pushed the throttles forward and climbed to 1,500 feet, bombing altitude. His bombardier, Sergeant Bramer, armed the 4 500-pound bombs in the bomb bay. The targets appeared exactly where intelligence had predicted them. Doolittle's primary target was a factory complex in northern Tokyo. At 1,500 feet, traveling at 225 mph, the B-25 lined up on its bombing run. Bramer called corrections. "Left, steady, bombs away!" 4 500-pound incendiary cluster bombs tumbled from the aircraft, starting their descent toward the factory buildings below. Doolittle immediately banked hard and dove for the deck, accelerating away from the target area. Behind him, the bombs impacted, starting fires across the factory complex. Only then did Japanese air raid sirens begin wailing across Tokyo. Citizens who moments before had been going about their daily activities stared in shock at the American bomber racing across the city at rooftop height. Some waved, thinking it was a Japanese aircraft. Others dove for cover, finally understanding what was happening. For the first time since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, Japan was under attack. The other bombers followed in sequence. Lieutenant Hoover's crew struck another factory area in Tokyo. Lieutenant Bob Gray's Whiskey Pete bombed an oil storage facility that erupted in flames. Captain David Jones in Hari Carrier targeted a naval installation. One by one, the B-25s roared across their targets, dropped their bombs, and disappeared, flying at treetop level toward the western horizon. Ted Lawson in Ruptured Duck approached Tokyo from the south. His targets were steel factories and dock facilities. As his bombardier released the bombs, Lawson saw Japanese fighters finally beginning to scramble from nearby airfields. "We could see them taking off below us. Zero's taxiing, getting ready to launch, but we were already past them, running west as fast as we could go." The entire attack lasted less than 30 minutes from first bomb to last. 16 bombers had struck the heart of the Japanese Empire in broad daylight, essentially unopposed. The Japanese had launched approximately 80 fighters to intercept, but they never caught the bombers. The B-25s were simply too fast, too low, and gone too quickly. One aircraft reported being chased by fighters, but easily outran them at low altitude. The damage inflicted was relatively minor in military terms. Several factories were hit, some fuel storage tanks destroyed, and fires started across Tokyo and other cities. But the psychological impact was enormous. Japanese radio broadcasts were interrupted with news that enemy bombers had attacked Tokyo. Citizens who had been told their homeland was invulnerable saw American aircraft overhead. The Japanese military, which had claimed absolute control of Asian skies, had failed to stop a small raiding force from bombing the capital. But now came the hard part. The 16 bombers had to fly another 2,200 miles over Japanese-occupied China, running on fumes, hoping to reach friendly territory before their fuel ran out. And they would have to do it as night fell, flying over mountainous terrain in deteriorating weather with no radio beacons and no landing lights. The successful bombing was just the beginning of their ordeal. The B-25s fled westward across Japan, flying at wave-top height over the Sea of Japan. Doolittle's aircraft crossed the Japanese coastline at 1:30 p.m. and headed out over open water toward China. The fuel gauges showed steady consumption. The additional fuel tanks were working as planned, but the early launch meant they were burning fuel they had counted on having in reserve. As darkness fell, the crews faced increasingly difficult decisions. They were flying over Japanese-occupied China, following a southern route that should bring them to Chinese-held territory. But they couldn't see the ground. There were no lights below, no radio beacons, no way to know their exact position. The fuel gauges continued to drop. Doolittle's plan had called for landing at Chinese airfields near Chuchao, now Kuzhou. The Chinese Air Force had been notified and was supposed to have runway lights prepared. But a tragic communication failure doomed this plan. The message requesting the Chinese to prepare the airfields never arrived. Chiang Kai-shek's military commanders, unaware that American bombers were coming, had ordered all navigation beacons and airfield lights turned off due to Japanese air activity. The Americans were flying toward dark, unmarked fields in the middle of nowhere. By 8:00 p.m., Doolittle's fuel gauges were reading empty. He was flying over mountainous terrain in total darkness, with no idea where the nearest friendly territory was. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Cole, checked their dead reckoning position. "We should be over friendly Chinese territory, somewhere." Doolittle made the decision. "We're not going to find an airfield. Prepare to bail out." The crew put on their parachutes and checked their escape equipment. Each man had a leather flying jacket, a .45 pistol, emergency rations, a silk map of China, and a small amount of Chinese currency. They also carried blood chits, American flags with messages in Chinese explaining that they were American airmen fighting Japan and requesting assistance. At 9:30 p.m., with the engines beginning to sputter from fuel starvation, Doolittle set the B-25 on autopilot, pointed it away from any visible lights, and ordered his crew to jump. Doolittle went last, as aircraft commanders always did. He jumped into the darkness at 8,000 feet, uncertain whether he was over friendly territory or Japanese-occupied China. His parachute opened perfectly, and he drifted down through the rain toward an invisible ground below. He landed hard in a rice paddy, unhurt but soaked with mud and water. Above him, his B-25 continued flying on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed into a mountainside miles away. One by one, the other bombers ran out of fuel. 15 crews bailed out into the darkness over China. Only one aircraft, piloted by Captain Edward York, took a different course. Critically low on fuel and unable to reach China, York turned north toward the Soviet Union. He landed his bomber at Vladivostok, where the crew was interned. The Soviets, not yet at war with Japan and bound by their neutrality pact, couldn't officially release them. York and his crew spent over a year in Soviet custody before being allowed to escape across the border into Iran. They eventually returned to the United States, the only complete crew to survive with their aircraft. The other 80 men scattered across the Chinese countryside faced far more uncertain fates. Some landed in friendly territory and were helped by Chinese civilians and military forces. Others came down in Japanese-occupied areas and were captured. Still others landed in remote mountains and had to walk for days to reach safety. What followed would test these men far more severely than the bombing raid itself. Doolittle landed in his rice paddy and spent the night sheltering under his parachute, waiting for dawn. He had no idea where he was or whether he was in friendly territory. When morning came, Chinese farmers found him and, recognizing his American uniform and blood chit, took him to Chinese military forces. Over the next several days, Doolittle was reunited with most of his crew and with crews from other bombers. The Chinese response was heroic. Despite the risk of brutal Japanese reprisals, Chinese civilians and soldiers helped the American airmen evade capture. They provided food, shelter, medical care, and guides to lead the Americans toward friendly territory. The Chinese knew what helping Americans would cost them. The Japanese military would exact terrible revenge on any villages that aided the Doolittle Raiders. Yet they helped anyway. Ted Lawson's crew had a more difficult landing. Ruptured Duck ran out of fuel just short of the Chinese coast and ditched in the ocean. The B-25 hit the water hard in complete darkness. The impact was violent, smashing the aircraft apart. Lawson was severely injured, his leg nearly severed. Corporal Leland Factor, the gunner, was hurt. but managed to pull Lawson from the wreckage before the bomber sank. The crew made it to shore, but Lawson was in critical condition, bleeding heavily and in shock. Chinese civilians found them and carried Lawson on a stretcher for days, seeking medical help. Eventually, they reached a Chinese military doctor who attempted to treat Lawson's wounds. But infection had set in. The doctor, working with primitive equipment in a small village clinic, had no choice. He amputated Lawson's leg without anesthesia, using only local painkiller. Lawson survived the operation and eventually made it to safety, though he would spend over a year recovering from his injuries. Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, the 20-year-old engineer-gunner on Lawson's crew, became the hero of the ordeal. Despite his own injuries, Thatcher tended to his wounded crewmates for days, treating injuries, finding food, and keeping the men alive until Chinese help arrived. He would later receive the Silver Star for his actions, one of the most deserved decorations of the entire raid. Not all crews were as fortunate. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's bomber, Crew 6, came down in Japanese-occupied territory. Hallmark and his crew were captured by Japanese forces on April 19th. Lieutenant William Farrow's crew and Lieutenant Robert Height's crew were also captured. 8 men total fell into Japanese hands. What followed was a nightmare. The Japanese military, humiliated by the successful attack on their homeland, wanted revenge. The captured airmen were transported to Tokyo, where they were interrogated, tortured, and held in military prison. They were beaten, starved, and subjected to psychological abuse designed to break their spirits. The Japanese wanted confessions that the raid had deliberately targeted civilians. They wanted propaganda they could use to portray America as barbaric. The captured Americans refused to cooperate. In August 1942, a Japanese military tribunal tried the 8 captured airmen for war crimes. The charges were absurd, claiming the Americans had deliberately bombed schools and hospitals. The trial was a mockery of justice, with no defense allowed and the verdict predetermined. All 8 men were sentenced to death. International pressure led the Japanese to commute 5 of the sentences to life imprisonment. But 3 men, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. They faced their execution with courage, refusing blindfolds and standing straight as the bullets ended their lives. They were 24, 24, and 25 years old. The remaining 5 prisoners, Lieutenant Robert Height, Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, Sergeant George Barr, and Corporal Robert Meter, remained in Japanese custody under horrific conditions. They were held in solitary confinement, given starvation rations, and denied medical care. Corporal Meter died of malnutrition and disease in December 1943, his body simply giving out after 20 months of abuse. The remaining 4 men survived until American forces liberated them in August 1945, weighing less than 100 pounds each, permanently damaged by their ordeal. But the suffering didn't end with the captured airmen. The Japanese military launched a vengeful campaign against Chinese civilians who had helped the Americans. Entire villages were destroyed. Estimates suggest that approximately 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in Japanese reprisals for helping the Doolittle Raiders. The price paid by innocent Chinese people far exceeded anything the American airmen had imagined. The Chinese people's sacrifice to help American servicemen stands as one of the most tragic and heroic aspects of the entire raid. Of the 80 men who flew the Doolittle Raid, 69 eventually made it to safety. 3 were killed when their aircraft crashed or ditched. 8 were captured by the Japanese, with 3 executed and 1 dying in captivity. 5 remained prisoners until war's end. The survivors faced an arduous journey out of China, traveling by foot, boat, and eventually aircraft to reach India, then home to the United States. Doolittle, reunited with most of his crew and many other raiders, made his way to Chongqing, China's wartime capital. There he met with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who praised the raid and the courage of American airmen. But Doolittle was devastated by what he saw as his failure. He had lost all 16 aircraft. Men were dead or captured. The mission had succeeded in bombing Japan, but at what cost? "I thought they'd court-martial me," Doolittle later admitted. "We'd lost all the planes. We'd lost men. I'd convinced Hap Arnold to let me lead the mission, and now I'd come back with nothing but casualties and destroyed aircraft. I expected to be court-martialed and spend the rest of the war flying a desk, if I was lucky." The raid's strategic impact was far greater than the physical damage inflicted. The bombing of Tokyo shocked Japanese military leadership. They had promised the emperor that the homeland would never be attacked. That promise was now broken. The Japanese military understood that if American bombers could reach Tokyo in April 1942, they would return in greater numbers with larger bombers. The homeland was vulnerable. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The date that would live in infamy. As Japanese bombs rained down on the Pacific Fleet, destroying battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans, the United States was thrust into World War II. In the months that followed, the news only got worse. Wake Island fell. Guam was captured. The Philippines were being overrun. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia like an unstoppable tide. By early 1942, America was reeling, desperate for any kind of victory, any sign that Japan wasn't invincible. What no one knew was that a plan was already forming. A plan so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that most military experts would have called it suicide. The idea? Launch fully loaded Army bombers from an aircraft carrier, bomb the Japanese mainland, and somehow make it to safety in China. It had never been done before. The bombers were too big, the distances too far, the risks too enormous. But one man believed it could work. His name was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, and he was about to lead 80 volunteers on a one-way mission that would change the course of the war. This is the story of how 16 B-25 bombers, launched from a pitching carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, struck at the heart of the Japanese Empire just 4 months after Pearl Harbor. It's a story of innovation, courage, and impossible odds. A story where success meant survival was optional. Before we discover how these men accomplished the impossible, tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with history enthusiasts worldwide who understand that sometimes the most important victories aren't measured in territory gained, but in spirits lifted and enemies rattled. January 1942. Washington, D.C. President Franklin Roosevelt was under immense pressure. The American public was traumatized by Pearl Harbor and terrified by Japanese advances across the Pacific. Every military briefing brought worse news. The Philippines were falling. General Douglas MacArthur had been forced to retreat to Australia. Japanese submarines were operating off the California coast. Americans were beginning to wonder if their own mainland might be next. In a meeting with military planners, Roosevelt made his desires clear. He wanted to strike back at Japan, not in some distant Pacific island, but at Japan itself. He wanted to hit Tokyo. The problem was simple and seemingly insurmountable. There was no way to reach Japan with American bombers. The Pacific Fleet was crippled at Pearl Harbor. There were no Allied bases close enough to launch a bombing raid on the Japanese home islands. Every strategic bomber in the American arsenal lacked the range to reach Japan and return safely. Captain Francis Lowe, a submariner on Admiral Ernest King's staff, had been inspecting naval facilities in Norfolk, Virginia, when he noticed something interesting. Army bombers were practicing carrier takeoffs, simulating attacks on enemy ships. The sight sparked an idea so radical that he initially dismissed it as crazy. But the more he thought about it, the more possible it seemed. What if Army bombers could actually take off from a Navy carrier, bomb Japan, and continue flying west to land in China? Lowe presented the idea to Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King, known for his aggressive nature and willingness to take risks, was immediately intrigued. The concept was revolutionary. Carriers had been designed for naval aircraft, smaller planes with folding wings and tailhooks for landing. Army bombers were massive by comparison, with much longer takeoff requirements. No one had ever launched heavy bombers from a carrier deck, but King saw the strategic brilliance. If it could be done, America could strike Japan months, perhaps years, before anyone thought possible. King brought the idea to General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces. Arnold's response was characteristic of the man who had built the Air Forces into a modern fighting force. "That's a hell of an idea. Let's find someone crazy enough to lead it." Arnold knew exactly who to call. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a 45-year-old aviator who was already a legend in American aviation. Doolittle's resume read like an adventure novel. He had earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He had won virtually every air race in the 1920s and 1930s. He had performed the first outside loop, the first instrument-only flight, and countless other aviation firsts. He had retired from the Army in 1930 to work for Shell Oil, pioneering high-octane aviation fuel. When war broke out, he immediately returned to active duty. Now Arnold was offering him the most dangerous mission of his life. "What do you think, Jimmy?" Arnold asked, laying out the basic concept. "Can Army bombers take off from a carrier?" Doolittle's mind was already calculating weights, distances, and fuel loads. "They can take off. That's the easy part. The hard part is what happens after the bombing. The planes won't have enough fuel to reach any Allied territory. The crews will have to bail out over China and hope the Chinese can help them evade the Japanese. It's essentially a one-way mission." Arnold nodded grimly. "I know. But we need this, Jimmy. The country needs to see that Japan isn't invincible, that we can hit them in their own backyard. Will you plan it?" Doolittle's response was immediate. "I'll do more than plan it. I'll lead it." Arnold tried to object. Doolittle was too valuable, knew too much about classified programs and aircraft under development. If he was captured, the intelligence loss would be devastating. But Doolittle was adamant. "You can't ask men to volunteer for a mission this dangerous and then stay behind yourself. I'm going, Hap. That's non-negotiable." The first challenge was selecting the right aircraft. It had to be a medium bomber, large enough to carry a meaningful bomb load, but small enough to possibly take off from a carrier deck. The Army had several medium bombers, but one stood out: the North American B-25 Mitchell. Named after aviation pioneer Billy Mitchell, the B-25 was a twin-engine bomber with a 67-foot wingspan, 53 feet long, and weighing 27,000 pounds fully loaded. It normally required a 3,000-foot runway for takeoff. The USS Hornet's flight deck was 800 feet long, and half of that would be occupied by other B-25s spotted behind the lead aircraft. In early February 1942, two B-25s were loaded aboard the USS Hornet while it was docked in Norfolk. The Navy wanted to test whether the bombers could actually take off. Lieutenant John Fitzgerald, a Navy test pilot, climbed into the first B-25. He had never flown a bomber before, only carrier-based fighters. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller, an experienced B-25 pilot from the Army, would fly the second aircraft. The Hornet steamed into the Atlantic. Fitzgerald's B-25 was positioned at the very rear of the flight deck, giving him the full 800 feet. With the carrier turning into a 40-knot wind, creating a total wind speed over the deck of 60 knots, Fitzgerald pushed the throttles forward. The Mitchell rumbled down the deck, engines roaring. Just as it seemed the bomber would run out of deck, the nose lifted, and the B-25 was airborne, climbing steadily away from the carrier. Miller followed moments later. Both takeoffs were successful. The test proved it could be done, but barely. The bombers would need every advantage. Doolittle immediately began planning modifications. Extra fuel tanks would be installed in every available space, including the bomb bay, crawlways, and even in a rubber bladder where the lower gun turret had been. The additional fuel would increase range from 1,300 miles to approximately 2,400 miles. Still not enough to reach any Allied airfield, but enough to reach the Chinese coast and push inland before running out of fuel. Weight had to be stripped from every aircraft. The heavy Norden bomb sight was removed and replaced with a simple makeshift sight designed by Captain C. Ross Greening, one of the pilots. It was made from 2 pieces of aluminum and cost 20 cents to manufacture compared to the $10,000 Norden sight. The lower gun turret was removed to save weight and make room for the fuel bladder. Radio equipment was minimized. Every unnecessary item was stripped out. Even with these modifications, the B-25s would be operating at the absolute edge of their performance envelope. Doolittle personally supervised the modification of 24 B-25B aircraft at the Mid-Continent Airlines facility in Minneapolis. The work was done in absolute secrecy. Workers were told the modifications were for a special ferry mission. No one outside a handful of senior officers knew the true purpose. As the modifications progressed, Doolittle began the delicate task of selecting volunteers for what he privately knew was likely a suicide mission. The call went out to B-25 squadrons across the country. Volunteers needed for an extremely hazardous mission. No details provided. No guarantee of survival. The response was overwhelming. Every pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and gunner wanted in. Doolittle needed 80 men for 16 crews, plus spares. He selected 24 complete crews and began training at Eglin Field in Florida. The crews ranged in age from 20 to 40. They came from every part of America. Farm boys and city kids, college graduates and high school dropouts. What they shared was youth, skill, and a burning desire to strike back at Japan. Among them were men who would become legends. Captain Ted Lawson, pilot of Crew Number 7, would write the best-selling book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo about the raid. His plane, named Ruptured Duck, would become one of the most famous aircraft of the war. Lieutenant Robert Gray would name his plane Whiskey Pete and show exceptional courage during the mission. First Lieutenant Travis Hoover would fly as Doolittle's wingman in the number 2 position. Lieutenant Richard Joyce, at 23, was one of the youngest aircraft commanders. Captain David Jones would pilot Harry Carrier and face one of the most difficult decisions of the raid. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark would command Crew 6, not knowing he was flying toward capture, torture, and execution. Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, just 20 years old, would become one of the heroes of the raid through his actions after the bombing. Corporal Leland Factor would serve as gunner on Lawson's crew and survive against impossible odds. The training at Eglin was brutal and mysterious. The crews practiced short-field takeoffs over and over, learning to get their bombers airborne in impossibly short distances. They practiced low-level navigation over water. They flew practice bomb runs at altitudes as low as 200 feet. But Doolittle told them nothing about the actual mission. He couldn't risk the information leaking. The crews developed theories. Some thought they were training to bomb Germany from secret bases in England. Others guessed they were preparing for attacks on Japanese positions in the Pacific. No one suspected they would be launching from a carrier to bomb Tokyo itself. In late March, the modified B-25s were flown to Alameda Naval Air Station in California. There, for the first time, the crews saw their transport. The USS Hornet, one of the Navy's newest fleet carriers, sat at the dock, and crowding its deck were 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, their wings hanging over the side of the flight deck, looking impossibly large against the carrier's superstructure. The sight finally revealed the truth to the crews. They were going to launch Army bombers from a Navy carrier. The impossible was about to become reality. April 2nd, 1942. San Francisco Bay. Thousands of civilians lined the waterfront, watching the USS Hornet depart. They could clearly see the Army bombers lashed to the flight deck. The sight was so unusual that speculation ran wild. Some newspapers reported that the Hornet was ferrying bombers to Hawaii or some Pacific island. The Japanese consul in San Francisco sent reports to Tokyo about the carrier with Army bombers, but Japanese intelligence dismissed it as routine ferry operations. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding officer of the Hornet, addressed his crew over the ship's intercom once they were at sea. "This ship will carry the Army bombers to within striking distance of Japan. The bombers will then take off from the deck and bomb military targets in Tokyo and other cities. The Japanese claim their mainland is invulnerable to attack. We're going to prove them wrong." The announcement was met with stunned silence, then wild cheering throughout the ship. The Navy crew, many of them survivors of Pearl Harbor or friends of those who had died, were eager to strike back. Over the next 2 weeks, they would work alongside the Army crews, helping them prepare for the impossible mission ahead. Lieutenant Henry Miller, the experienced Navy pilot who had performed the test takeoffs in February, was assigned as takeoff instructor. He drilled each B-25 crew relentlessly. "You'll take off with full fuel and full bomb load. The deck will be pitching in ocean swells. You'll have 400 to 450 feet of deck, no more. If you don't rotate at exactly the right moment, you'll stall and go into the ocean. The carrier can't stop to pick you up because that would endanger the entire task force. Get it right the first time because you only get one try." The Army crews practiced on deck while the Hornet steamed west. They walked through the takeoff procedures over and over. They calculated weight and balance. They checked and rechecked their fuel loads, bomb loads, and equipment. The Navy deck crews, who normally handled 12,000-pound fighters, learned to position and secure 27,000-pound bombers on the pitching deck. On April 13th, the Hornet rendezvoused with Task Force 16, commanded by Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey aboard the carrier USS Enterprise. Halsey's force would provide fighter cover and anti-submarine protection for the Hornet. The combined task force, including cruisers, destroyers, and oilers, turned toward Japan. They were now committed. Radio silence was absolute. The fleet traveled at high speed, refueling at sea, running directly toward the most heavily defended waters in the world. Doolittle's plan called for launching 400 miles from Japan on the evening of April 18th. The bombers would strike Tokyo and other cities at night, then continue west to land at Chinese airfields after dawn on April 19th. It was a tight timeline that left no margin for error. But at least it was a plan. What happened next would force Doolittle to throw out the plan entirely and improvise a solution that would save the mission, but doom the crews to an uncertain fate. April 18, 1942, 3 hours a.m. The task force was still 650 miles from Japan, running in through the night at 20 knots. On the Hornet's darkened flight deck, Army crews slept beside their bombers, catching rest before the mission. In the ready room, Doolittle and his officers were making final preparations for the evening launch that was still 15 hours away. Then the radio crackled with an alarm from the Enterprise. A picket boat had been spotted. The Japanese vessel Nido Maru, a 150-ton fishing boat serving as an early warning picket, had spotted the American task force. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire immediately, shredding the small vessel with 6-inch guns. But the damage was done. Before it sank, the Nido Maru had transmitted a warning to Tokyo. American carriers approaching from the east. On the Hornet's bridge, Admiral Halsey made the decision. The task force would turn back immediately. The carriers were too valuable to risk in daylight attacks by Japanese bombers. But what about the B-25s? Halsey sent a signal to Captain Mitcher on the Hornet. "Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command, good luck and God bless you." Doolittle was woken and given the news. Instead of launching at 400 miles in the evening, they would launch immediately at 650 miles in broad daylight. The additional 250 miles meant the bombers didn't have enough fuel to reach the Chinese airfields. They would have to bomb Japan and continue flying toward China, hoping to reach the coast before running out of fuel. Then the crews would bail out into the darkness over occupied China and pray they could evade Japanese patrols. There was no discussion of canceling, no debate about the odds. Doolittle simply turned to his men. "We're going now. Check your planes. We launch in 1 hour." The Army crews scrambled to their aircraft. Navy deck crews removed the lashings and began positioning the bombers for launch. The sea was rough, with 30-foot swells causing the Hornet's bow to rise and fall dramatically. Rain squalls swept across the deck. It was far from ideal conditions for launching bombers that had never actually taken off from a carrier with full combat loads. The 16 B-25s were spotted on the deck in precise order. Doolittle's aircraft was at the far end, with only 467 feet of deck ahead of him. The remaining bombers were positioned behind, each giving the one ahead the maximum possible takeoff distance. The plan was for Doolittle to launch first, followed by the others at 1-minute intervals. The entire launch window was 16 minutes. After that, the carriers had to turn and run before Japanese aircraft arrived. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle climbed into his B-25. His crew consisted of Lieutenant Richard Cole as co-pilot, Lieutenant Henry Potter as navigator, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer as bombardier, and Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard as flight engineer gunner. They were crew number 1, and they would be first off the deck. Doolittle started both engines, running through his checklist with the precision that had made him a legendary test pilot.